I'm Jess, and I need to tell you about the moment that changed everything. It happened at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday night in the ER at County General Hospital. A military helicopter had crashed 6 miles outside the city, and 2 survivors were incoming. One of them was barely hanging on. The doors burst open, and they wheeled him in fast. Too fast for a normal arrival. The man on the stretcher was covered in blood. His flight suit was torn. There were burns on his arms, and he had the kind of exhaustion in his face that comes from surviving something you weren't supposed to survive. But his eyes were open. He was conscious. He was fading, but he was still there. The ER team moved around him like a well-oiled machine. Dr. Alan Morrison, the attending, was calling out orders. Nurses were running vitals. Someone was setting up 2 large-bore IVs. The monitors were beeping their urgent rhythm. This was the controlled chaos that happens when a critical patient arrives. Everyone knows their role, everyone moves fast, and there's no room for hesitation. But then, something changed. Rachel Dunn was the night nurse assigned to this patient. Mid-30s, athletic even under her loose scrubs, short dark hair tucked behind her ears, hazel eyes that usually showed nothing but professional calm. She was checking vitals when the pilot opened his eyes and looked directly at her. Not at Morrison, not at the monitors, at her. His hand came up. It took everything he had, but he reached for her wrist. His weathered fingers, the fingers of a man who'd spent 40-some years in military aircraft, found the rope bracelet on her right wrist. It was paracord, handmade, faded from years of wear. The kind of bracelet you don't just find in a store. His eyes widened. And then, with what little voice he had left, he whispered a single word. Phantom. Rachel's clipboard hit the floor. The sound echoed through the ER. Papers scattered. And for a moment, just a moment, the entire team went silent. Morrison looked up from his notes. Chen, the intern who'd been watching everything, froze. Rachel's face went white. Not scared white. Recognized white. The pilot's eyes closed, and his hand dropped. He'd said what he needed to say. He was back to being a critical patient, back to being a stranger in an ER. But Rachel knew better. I'm Jess, and this is the story behind that one word, and why a clipboard falling to the floor in a hospital emergency room at 2:47 a.m. was actually the moment when a secret that had been buried for 7 years finally came to light. Let me rewind 3 hours. Rachel's shift started at 11 p.m., like most of her shifts. She clocked in, checked the patient board, and moved through the early morning hours with the kind of efficiency that made her invisible. That was the goal. Invisible was safe. Invisible meant nobody asked questions. Invisible meant nobody dug into her background. The ER that night was typical for a Tuesday. A few minor injuries, 2 drunk drivers from a single car accident, a regular who came in claiming chest pain, he always claimed chest pain, and the usual parade of people who had nowhere else to go. Rachel moved between rooms with her charting and her vitals and her professional distance. She was good at her job. She was very good at her job. Good enough that she could do it on autopilot, and that's exactly what she wanted. Dr. Alan Morrison was the attending that night. 50-something silver hair, the kind of doctor who followed protocols the way other people followed breathing instructions. He was competent. He was careful. He was also the type who believed that if something wasn't written in the official medical literature, it probably wasn't worth doing. He noticed Rachel from time to time. She was efficient, reliable, the kind of nurse you wanted during a rough shift, but he didn't notice anything unusual about her. How could he? Unusual was the one thing Rachel had spent 7 years learning to hide. Chen was the new intern, 23 years old, sharp as a blade, and watching everything like she was trying to absorb the entire structure of emergency medicine through pure observation. She'd asked Rachel questions twice already that night. Once about the protocol for treating a diabetic patient. Once about when to escalate a situation to Morrison. Rachel had answered both questions with clipped, professional responses and moved on. Chen had watched her go, curious but not quite daring to push further. The paracord bracelet was visible on Rachel's wrist, but nobody ever asked about it. People wore things. Medical bracelets, hospital ID lanyards, random accessories that meant something to them but nothing to anyone else. The bracelet was faded, truly faded, the kind of wear that comes from years of constant use. It had been handmade by someone who knew how to tie military knots. But again, nobody asked. Now, here's what you need to understand about Rachel. She wasn't hiding because she was running from something. She was hiding because staying hidden was the only way to survive what she'd been through. 7 years earlier, she'd been a different person entirely. Not a name change, not a relocation, nothing that dramatic. Just a complete recalibration of who she was and how she existed in the world. Rachel had been a combat medic. Not just any combat medic. She'd been a flight medic attached to special operations in Kandahar, which meant she flew out on mission support, landed in hot zones, and kept soldiers alive when they were bleeding out in places where the nearest real hospital was hundreds of miles away. She was exceptional at it. Her commanding officers said she had a gift. The ability to stay absolutely calm when everything was chaos, to make split-second decisions under impossible pressure, and to know which rules were made to be followed and which rules were made to be broken if it meant saving a life. She was exactly the kind of medic that special operators wanted on their missions. But 7 years ago, 3 members of her team didn't come home. The mission itself wasn't the problem. The team got in, got their objective, got out. No hostile contact, no ambush. Nobody died in combat. That's what made it worse. They died because Rachel was in the wrong place for exactly 30 seconds. An equipment failure, a radio malfunction, a series of small failures that cascaded into a moment where she was 2 minutes out on the medevac bird when the 3 soldiers who'd made it off the objective went into shock from internal bleeding that couldn't be stopped with what was available at the forward base. 3 soldiers, all of whom she knew. 2 of whom she'd saved before, on previous missions. And all 3 of whom died in the 38 minutes it took her to fly back from another location. The review board said it wasn't her fault. The commanding officer said it wasn't her fault. Her team said it wasn't her fault. It didn't matter what anyone else said. Rachel knew it was her fault, because she knew that if she'd been there, she would have found a way. She always found a way. Except that one time, when it mattered most, she didn't. So she left. Not a discharge. Technically, she transferred to a different posting. Then she requested medical training rotation at a civilian hospital. Then she applied to a civilian nursing program. Then she got her RN license. And then she disappeared into the quiet world of hospital night shifts, and nobody asks questions anonymity. She kept the paracord bracelet because it was the only thing that connected her to who she used to be. But she wore it under her sleeve. And she never, ever talked about the military. She was a good nurse. She was an excellent nurse. She was just a nurse. That's what she told herself every night shift. That's what she repeated in the silence of her apartment at 3 a.m. That's what she believed most days. Then the call came in. It was 2:15 a.m. when the dispatch alert went out. Military helicopter down, 6 miles outside city limits. 2 survivors en route. Critical and stable, ETA 7 minutes. Rachel heard the alert like she heard every alert. processing the information, moving her current patients into position for the incoming emergency, clearing beds, pulling supplies. Routine. This is what ER nurses did. Incoming trauma meant you prepared, you moved, you got ready. But when the alert specified military helicopter, something changed in Rachel's body. It was subtle. A tightening in her chest, a quickening of her breath. Hands that moved just slightly faster. Morrison probably didn't notice. Chen might have, if she'd been watching specifically for something to change. But she wasn't. She was just watching Rachel move with her usual efficiency, not realizing that the efficiency had shifted into something different. Military meant she knew the protocols that mattered. Military meant she understood shock in ways most civilian nurses only learned from textbooks. Military meant she knew which interventions worked when textbook medicine hit the wall. Military meant she was about to be reminded of exactly who she used to be. The 7 minutes before arrival were the longest 7 minutes of Rachel's entire shift. Morrison was organizing the team, assigning positions, making sure they had backup for both patients. Chen was helping pull supplies, learning the rhythm. Rachel moved through the preparation with muscle memory that was older than her civilian nursing license. She was arranging equipment in a specific order, not the order they'd taught her in her RN program. The order that worked when you had exactly 90 seconds to stabilize someone before moving them to surgery. The order she'd learned in Kandahar. When the ambulance pulled up and the paramedics began their report, Rachel was already moving to the critical patient's bed. The pilot was still conscious, barely. Blood, burns, trauma from impact, shock setting in. His vitals were dropping. The stable patient, another flight crew member, was being directed to a different bay. Morrison took charge of the critical case, which was protocol. Rachel should have been assisting, following his lead, doing what he said when he said it. Except that Morrison, for all his competence and all his protocol expertise, didn't know what a human body looked like when it had been through what this pilot had been through. Morrison ordered an aggressive fluid resuscitation, flooding the patient with IV fluids to bring up his blood pressure. Standard protocol. Rachel could see on his face that he was declining. The fluid was going in, but his body was rejecting it, and the internal bleeding was worse than the surface damage suggested. Morrison hadn't seen enough field trauma to recognize the subtle signs. Rachel had seen enough to know that this patient needed a different approach. Not in the textbooks, not in the hospital protocols, in the field protocols. No, Rachel said. Morrison didn't even look up. Excuse me. Don't push the fluids. Rachel's voice came out sharp, clinical, different from how she'd sounded all night. He's compensating. Aggressive resuscitation is going to push him into decompensation. Morrison's hands paused for a moment. He was the attending, she was the nurse. This wasn't how the hierarchy worked. Rachel, we follow standard trauma protocol here. Standard protocol is going to kill him, Rachel said. She was already reaching for the IV pump, adjusting the rate down to a slow drip. He needs permissive hypotension. Lower fluids, higher pressure support. He's got internal bleeding you're not going to find until surgery, and flooding his system is just speeding up the bleed. Morrison stepped back from the bed. His face was showing something between confusion and anger. Who do you think you are? Someone who knows what they're looking at, Rachel said. Chen was watching this exchange with wide eyes. The rest of the ER team was carefully not looking at either of them, which meant everyone heard everything. This wasn't normal. This was a night nurse directly contradicting the attending physician. This wasn't supposed to happen. Morrison's jaw tightened. Rachel, I appreciate your input, but I'm the physician here. We follow protocol. Then he'll go into decompensation in the next 2 minutes, and you'll lose him," Rachel said. She wasn't asking anymore. She was telling. The pilot's monitor changed its rhythm. His blood pressure dropped another 5 points. Morrison's eyes narrowed, and he looked at the monitor, then at Rachel, then at the patient. He was a competent doctor. He could see the pattern too. But he wasn't going to take orders from a nurse, no matter what she claimed to see. "Get the anesthesia team ready," Morrison said to the intern. "We're going to surgery, now." It was the wrong call. Rachel knew it was the wrong call. She watched the pilot being prepped for transport to the OR. And she knew that if Morrison went into that surgery with the patient in this state, the surgery would be a disaster. The surgeon would find the internal bleeding, but they wouldn't be able to repair it if the patient's pressure was too high, too fast, too aggressive. The pilot would die on the table. Rachel stood there watching it happen. And for the first time in 7 years, she felt the weight of that old familiar failure pressing down on her chest. She was about to watch someone die because she couldn't make the system listen to her. She was about to become the person she'd tried so hard to stop being, the person who wasn't good enough. Except that's when the pilot's condition deteriorated faster than anyone expected. His oxygen saturation dropped. His heart rate spiked. The monitor's alarm went off in that particular pattern that meant the patient's body was shutting down. Morrison was still in the room, still in. The anesthesia team was still in the room. And in that moment of crisis, when everything stopped being about protocol and started being about survival, Morrison looked at Rachel. "What do you need?" he asked. Rachel moved. She didn't think about it. She didn't hesitate. She called out a procedure that she'd learned in the field, one that wasn't in the hospital's trauma manual, one that required specific knowledge about emergency blood pressure support in the context of severe internal bleeding. She talked Morrison through it. She guided him through steps that he'd never done in exactly this sequence. But she did it in the medical language that he understood. And he did what she said because there wasn't time for doubt. The patient stabilized, not fully, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to get to surgery with a chance. Enough that he didn't die on the ER floor. Morrison stared at her as the pilot was rushed to the OR. "Where did you learn that?" he asked quietly. Rachel didn't answer. She just turned to help Chen clean the bay. And she didn't meet Morrison's eyes. "This is the moment where I need to tell you something about what happens when you keep a secret for 7 years and then suddenly reveal it. Your entire carefully constructed identity can come apart in 90 seconds. Morrison wasn't going to let this go. He couldn't. He'd just watched a nurse perform emergency medicine that wasn't in any standard protocol, and he was going to want answers. But before he could ask those questions, the second patient was being brought into the ER. The stable survivor was the pilot's flight engineer. Early 50s, conscious, alert. Injuries that were painful but manageable. He was wheeled into the trauma bay, and the team shifted focus. Morrison had to attend to the surviving patient. The chaos of active emergency medical care consumed everyone's attention, and Rachel found herself alone for a moment. Standing in the corner of the ER, her hands shaking slightly, knowing that everything was about to change. The first patient, the critical one, was upstairs in the OR by 2:35 a.m. Morrison was with the second patient. Chen was assisting. And Rachel sat in the ER break room for exactly 4 minutes before the attending anesthesiologist came downstairs with an update. The surgery was going well. The patient was stable. They'd found the internal bleeding, and they were controlling it. The prognosis was good. He was going to live. Rachel sat with that information for a moment, and she let herself feel something she hadn't let herself feel in 7 years. Relief. not relief that someone had survived. She felt that regularly in the ER. Relief that she'd been able to help. Relief that her knowledge had mattered. Relief that the weight she'd been carrying for 7 years had shifted, just slightly. She didn't know yet that it was about to get much, much heavier. The pilot woke up in recovery, 3 hours after surgery. He was stable. The bleeding had been stopped. He was going to make a full recovery. He was going to fly again, probably. The surgeon found it remarkable, the way the initial emergency stabilization had made the surgery possible. Whoever did that emergency intervention in the ER saved his life, the surgeon told Morrison. If you'd gone in with him any less stable, we'd have lost him on the table. Morrison had looked at his notes, at the sequence of interventions, at the ones that didn't match the standard protocol, and he'd known exactly who had done that work. By 5 a.m., the pilot was alert enough to ask for water. By 5:30, he was asking who the dark-haired nurse was that he remembered from the ER. By 6 a.m., he was being told that Rachel was probably on her way out, since the morning shift was starting. But the pilot had asked for her, specifically asked for her, wanted to thank her, wanted to talk to her. So someone paged Rachel to the recovery room. I need to walk you through this next part carefully, because this is where everything that had been hidden for 7 years came into the light. Rachel went to the recovery room. She was professional. She was calm. She was doing her job, checking on a patient who had survived surgery. She was preparing to discharge her professional responsibility and walk away. The pilot opened his eyes. He was weathered, graying at his temples, green eyes that had seen as much as her own eyes had seen. He looked at her for a long moment, and then his eyes went to her wrist. The paracord bracelet was still there, still visible, still the same one she'd been wearing for 7 years, ever since that moment in Kandahar when a commanding officer, now deceased, had made it for her before her first field mission. He'd said it was for luck. It was really for connection. It was a way of saying, you belong to this unit. You belong to these people. The pilot's eyes widened. His weathered face shifted from confusion to recognition to something deeper. Realization. Phantom, he whispered. That word, that call sign, that name that she hadn't heard anyone speak in 7 years. Rachel's entire body went still. Call signs in the military aren't given randomly. They're earned. They're based on something about you, something you did, something you said, something that stuck. Rachel's call sign had come from her first field deployment. She'd been in the back of the bird during a firefight. The bird was taking rounds from multiple positions, and the pilot was trying to get them out. But one of the soldiers had been hit and was bleeding internally. Rachel had worked on him with no equipment, no support, nothing but her hands and her knowledge. And she'd kept him alive long enough to get to the forward operating base. Afterwards, the team had called her Phantom because she'd worked magic with nothing, because she'd made a death disappear before it could happen. The pilot who'd just whispered that call sign was someone who'd known her as Phantom, someone who'd served with her, someone who'd seen her do the work that her call sign described. "Do I know you?" Rachel asked. It was the only thing she could think to say. "Kandahar," he said. 7 years. You saved my life. You and the whole team were doing a medical supply run, and our convoy got hit. You were the one who stabilized me. You were the one who got me on the bird." Rachel could see it now. Captain Marcus Cole, that was his name. She remembered him. She didn't remember him clearly. There had been a lot of missions, a lot of soldiers, a lot of moments where she'd had to be Phantom instead of Rachel. But she remembered him now that he said it. He'd been young then, 40 years old, but young. He'd been hit in the leg, and the bleeding was arterial, and she'd applied the pressure bandage that had kept him conscious long enough to get help. She remembered thinking, at the time, that he was going to make it. She was right. "You remember," Marcus said. Not a question. A statement. Rachel looked at his face, at the worn lines around his eyes, at the way he was looking at her like she was the most important thing he'd ever seen. "I remember," she said. "I've been looking for you," Marcus said. "I've been looking for Phantom for 7 years. I wanted to find you, to thank you, to—" He stopped. His eyes went back to the bracelet. "But you were Phantom. And now you're civilian?" Rachel said quietly. "I'm civilian now." "You left," Marcus said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. "Yeah. Why?" Rachel didn't have a good answer for that. The truth was complicated. The truth was painful. The truth involved 3 soldiers whose names she still couldn't think about without feeling something break in her chest. The truth involved the moment she'd realized that she couldn't save everyone, and that knowing she couldn't save everyone meant she had to stop trying. "I had to," Rachel said, which wasn't the truth, but it was true enough. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, he looked at her differently. Not like she was Phantom anymore. Like he was seeing Rachel, the actual person underneath the call sign, underneath the paracord bracelet, underneath everything she'd been hiding. "Thank you," he said, "for saving me then. For saving me again last night. For being here." Rachel left the recovery room after 10 minutes. She made sure his vitals were stable. She checked his chart. She did her job. And then she left, and she went directly to the changing room. And she sat down on the bench, and she let herself shake for exactly 5 minutes. When she came out, she knew that her shift was over. She was going to clock out. She was going to go home. And she was going to have to figure out what it meant that someone who knew her as Phantom now knew her as Rachel. And that the wall between those 2 identities had just come down. What she didn't know was that Chen had been walking through the hospital at the exact moment when the pilot had whispered that call sign. Chen had heard it. Chen had seen Rachel's reaction, and Chen had questions. About 30 seconds after Rachel left the recovery room, Chen was at the nursing station, and she was looking at her computer screen with an intensity that suggested she'd found something she wasn't supposed to find. Morrison walked past. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "The pilot's chart," Chen said. "His name is Marcus Cole, Captain Marcus Cole. The anesthesia notes say that Rachel performed an intervention that isn't in our trauma protocol. The surgeon is calling it a field procedure. I heard him whisper something. The pilot whispered something. A call sign, I think. Phantom. And Rachel's reaction was different," Morrison said. He'd noticed too. "Really different," Chen said. "So I pulled the pilot's file, and his military record mentions someone with the call sign Phantom. Flight medic, special operations attached, 7 years of deployment records, then completely disappeared from the military database." "Disappeared," Morrison said. "Vanished," Chen said. "No discharge record, no transfer record, just gone. But the dates match up. 7 years ago, this Phantom stopped appearing in any military records. 7 years ago, right around when Rachel would have—" "No," Morrison said. But his voice wasn't certain. "It has to be," Chen said. "There's no other explanation. Rachel was a military medic, a special operations flight medic. She left, for whatever reason, she left. And she came here. She's been a civilian nurse for 7 years, and the pilot last night, he knows. He recognized her." Morrison's face was doing something complicated. he was processing a violation of every professional protocol he believed in. A nurse who had lied by omission about her background. A nurse who'd brought classified knowledge into a civilian hospital. A nurse who'd hidden who she was from everyone she worked with. But he was also processing that this nurse who had kept secrets, was also a nurse who'd just saved a patient's life with knowledge that his official training said she shouldn't even have. "We need to talk to her," Chen said. "She's still here. Her shift doesn't end for another 45 minutes. Morrison was already moving, walking toward the break room, walking toward the conversation that was about to happen, walking toward the moment when secrets stopped being hidden and became something that had to be explained. I need to pause here and talk about what happens when someone's entire identity is exposed. For 7 years, Rachel had built a life on the foundation of nobody knowing, nobody asking questions, nobody digging deeper. She'd constructed a version of herself that was entirely disconnected from Phantom. She was Rachel. Good nurse, reliable nurse. The kind of person you could count on, but not the kind of person you got close to. And now all of that was falling apart. And the falling apart was being orchestrated by an attending physician who was angry about protocol violations and an intern who'd found classified information in military databases. Rachel was sitting in the break room when Morrison walked in. She knew what was coming. She could see it on his face. "We need to talk," Morrison said. "I'm aware," Rachel said. "You were a military medic," Morrison said. Not a question. "Yes." "Flight medic, special operations." "Yes." "And you've been working here for 7 years without disclosing that information." Rachel didn't answer. She didn't need to. The answer was obvious. "You brought classified knowledge into a civilian hospital," Morrison continued. "You used procedures that aren't in our protocols. You performed an intervention that you were never trained to perform in a civilian context." "I saved a life," Rachel said quietly. "That's not the point," Morrison said. "It's exactly the point," Rachel said. She looked at him directly now. "You were about to kill him with your protocol. I changed the outcome. That's the only point that matters. The point is that I don't know who you are," Morrison said. "The point is that you've been lying through a mission to everyone you work with. The point is that there are regulations about this, certifications, disclosures." "There are," Rachel said. "And I violated all of them. I'm aware." Morrison sat down. He looked tired. Why? Why hide it? Rachel was quiet for a long moment. She looked at her hands, at the paracord bracelet, at the physical embodiment of every call sign, every mission, every moment she'd spent being Phantom. "Because Phantom got 3 people killed," she said. Morrison's expression shifted. Chen, who had appeared in the doorway and was listening, froze. "7 years ago, I was a field medic," Rachel continued. "I was good at what I did. I knew the protocols. I knew how to save lives under fire. I was confident in my ability to do the job. And one day, I made a decision to be somewhere else, on a mission. An equipment failure, a radio issue. I was in the wrong place for 38 minutes. By the time I got back to where I was supposed to be, 3 soldiers were dead. Soldiers I'd trained with. Soldiers I'd saved before. Soldiers who would have lived if I'd been there. The break room was completely silent. The review board said it wasn't my fault," Rachel said. "My commanding officers said it wasn't my fault. The team said it wasn't my fault. But I was a combat medic. The entire job was being there when people needed me. And I wasn't there. So Phantom, the person who had this reputation for being able to save anyone, who had this call sign that meant invincible, Phantom failed, and 3 people died. Rachel, Morrison said. So I left, Rachel said. I transferred out of special operations. I did civilian medical training. I got my RN license. I became a different person in a different place where nobody knew who I used to be. Because Phantom was a liar. Phantom made people think I was someone I wasn't. And I needed to stop being her. Chen had moved into the room now. She was listening like her life depended on it, which, in a sense, it did. Because she was learning about what happens when you carry the weight of impossible expectations and try to disappear underneath the burden of them. But you're still a medic, Chen said quietly. I was a medic, Rachel said. Now I'm a nurse. You were a good medic, Chen said. You saved him. Last night, you saved him again. I was just doing my job, Rachel said. No, Chen said. You were doing your real job. You were being Phantom. Rachel didn't respond. Morrison was thinking, working through something in his mind. After a long moment, he said, You should have reported your military medical background to the hospital. That's protocol. I know, Rachel said. You should have disclosed your special operations training. I know. You violated multiple regulations. I know, Rachel said. And I'd do it again because he would have died otherwise. Morrison was quiet. Then he said, The pilot's captain, Cole. He knew you. He knew Phantom, Rachel said. That's not the same thing as knowing me. I think it is, Morrison said. He stood up. You're suspended, pending an investigation into your background and your medical practices. HR will be contacting you. I can't make that decision alone. This goes above me. Rachel nodded. She'd expected that. But, Morrison said, and he stopped at the doorway. Between you and me, I wouldn't want to be operated on by someone who knows the textbook. I'd want to be operated on by someone who knows the reality of what a human body looks like under extreme conditions. Don't lose that. Then he was gone, and Rachel was alone with Chen, who was still looking at her like she'd just watched someone take off a mask and show their real face. Why did you leave? Chen asked. If you were that good at what you do, why would you give it up? Because the weight got too heavy, Rachel said. Because I couldn't carry the expectation that I could save everyone, and I couldn't live with the failure when I couldn't. Because sometimes you have to make a choice between who people think you are and who you actually are. And I chose to be human instead of legend. But you came back last night, Chen said. You were Phantom again. I know, Rachel said. Are you going back? To the military? No, Rachel said. She was sure about that at least. I'm not going back, but I'm also not hiding anymore. She took off her scrubs after that, clocked out, left the hospital. The suspension meant she wasn't coming back, at least not immediately. There would be investigations, there would be interviews. There would be people who wanted to know how someone with her background had ended up working as a civilian nurse in a civilian hospital without a single background check catching her military history. The truth was that Rachel had covered her tracks well. She'd left the military quietly, transferred through medical training programs, and applied to nursing positions without mentioning anything about her previous work. The hospitals never dug deep enough. The background checks never found anything because they weren't looking for classified military service. They were looking for criminal records and certifications. Rachel had just fallen through the cracks between systems. By the time she got home, it was 7 a.m., and her suspension was already official. Morrison had sent her a letter. HR would be calling. The hospital administrator would want to talk to her. She made coffee and sat on her couch and looked at the paracord bracelet. For 7 years, she'd hidden behind this, worn it under her sleeves, treated it like a secret, kept it connected to the part of her that was Phantom. But Phantom had saved Marcus Cole last night. Phantom had known exactly what he needed, and Phantom had been strong enough to make that happen. And Rachel, the person who was supposed to be hiding, Rachel was the one who was present enough to do it. Maybe they weren't as different as she thought. By 9 a.m., her phone was ringing. It was the hospital's legal department. They wanted to schedule an interview. By 10 a.m., there was an email from the Department of Defense. They wanted information about classified materials in civilian healthcare settings. By 11 a.m., her phone rang again. It was Marcus Cole. "They won't let me leave," he said. "The doctors say I need another day of observation. But I wanted to talk to you. I've been trying to figure out how to get your number, and a very helpful nurse mentioned you might have just lost your job." "News travels fast," Rachel said. "It does in a hospital," Marcus said. "Look, I know you don't want to talk about this. I know you left the military for reasons that mattered to you. But I also know that you saved my life twice. Once in Kandahar, and once last night in that ER. And I just wanted to tell you, that I don't think you failed." Rachel didn't speak. "The 3 soldiers," Marcus said. "I know that's what happened. That's what sent you away. But Phantom, here's the thing. You saved 42 people over 7 years of field deployment. 42. And 3 soldiers died. And you've spent 7 years mourning the 3 like you failed all of them. But what about the 42? "That's not how it works," Rachel said quietly. "I know," Marcus said. "But that's how it should work. That's how it works for me anyway. You saved my life. I got to come home. I got to fly for another 7 years. I got to..." He paused. "Well, I got to crash my helicopter last night, which is its own story. But the point is, I'm alive because of you, and I'm grateful. And I wanted to make sure you knew that." After Rachel hung up, she sat in her apartment for a long time, and she thought about the weight of failure versus the weight of success. About how she'd measured her life in the 3 people she couldn't save instead of the 42 people she could. About how hiding was supposed to make things easier. But all it had done was make her invisible. The next 72 hours were complicated. There were interviews with HR. There were conversations with lawyers. The Department of Defense wanted to know if she'd disclosed classified information. The hospital wanted to know how extensive her background was. Everyone wanted answers that explained how a secret could hide so completely in a system that was supposed to check everything. Rachel answered truthfully. Yes, she'd been a special operations flight medic. Yes, she'd left 7 years ago. Yes, she'd withheld that information from her employers. No, she hadn't disclosed any classified information. She'd simply used medical knowledge that she had, legally acquired while on active duty. Yes, she understood this was a violation of hospital policy regarding background disclosure. By the time the interviews were done, Rachel had been told that she would face potential termination from her position, that her nursing license might be reviewed, that there could be legal implications regarding her military service records. But she'd also been told something else. The hospital's legal team had dug into the specific procedure she'd performed, the one that wasn't in the civilian trauma manual, and they discovered that, while it wasn't standard American protocol, it was actually a recognized intervention in the British medical system and in some European countries. It was uncommon in the US, but not illegal. And more importantly, it was documented in the literature. It was real medicine, not improvisation. meaning that what Rachel had done wasn't reckless. It was educated application of knowledge that existed in legitimate medical contexts, meaning that she hadn't violated basic medical standards, even though she'd violated hospital policy. On the 4th day after her suspension, Morrison called her. "The hospital administrator wants to meet with you," he said. "In my office. Tomorrow at 2 p.m. Rachel went to the hospital the next day, and she walked through the same ER where she'd been suspended. The staff looked at her differently now. Some of them knew. All of them had probably heard. She could feel it in the way they watched her move through the space. In Morrison's office, she found not just the administrator, but also the surgeon who'd performed the pilot's operation. "We've been reviewing the circumstances of your employment," the administrator said. He was older, serious, the kind of person who took protocols very seriously. "You violated multiple policies regarding disclosure of your military background. That's a significant issue." Rachel nodded. She'd known this was coming. "However," the surgeon said, "you also performed emergency medicine that kept a patient alive when he would have died under standard protocol. And that's also significant. The question we're asking ourselves," the administrator continued, "is whether the protocols matter more than the outcome, or whether we have an opportunity to do something unusual here." "What do you mean?" Rachel asked. "I mean," the administrator said, "that we want to offer you a position in our trauma division with full disclosure of your military background. You would be working under the strict supervision of a physician, and all of your procedures would be reviewed. But instead of hiding what you are, you'd be operating as a trauma specialist who brings field medicine experience to civilian emergency care." Rachel's hands were shaking. This wasn't what she'd expected. "The military background wouldn't be hidden," the administrator continued. "You'd be listed as having special operations medical training. You'd be brought in on the most complex cases. You'd be doing what you do best, but transparently, and within a system that understands and supports that work." "What about my nursing license?" Rachel asked. "Your nursing license will be reviewed," the surgeon said. "But based on the evidence we've compiled, there's no reason it should be revoked. You didn't practice outside your scope. You practiced at the top of your scope." It took Rachel a moment to process this. She'd spent 7 years preparing to lose everything. She'd expected the suspension to lead to termination. She'd expected the investigation to lead to repercussions. She'd prepared herself for the consequences of being found out. Instead, she was being offered the things she'd been hiding from, the things she was actually good at, the thing that mattered. "I need to think about it," Rachel said. "Of course," the administrator said. "Take the time you need." She walked out of Morrison's office and found Chen waiting in the hallway. "So?" Chen asked. "They want me to stay," Rachel said, "as a trauma specialist." "Of course they do," Chen said. "You're exactly what this hospital needs." Rachel looked at the younger woman. "Why are you so certain about this?" "Because I watched you save someone's life with knowledge that came from somewhere real," Chen said. "Not from a textbook, from actually being there, actually doing the work, actually knowing what it takes. That's not something you can teach. That's something you are." Over the next week, Rachel considered her options. She could take the position. She could refuse and disappear again. She could fight the hospital on their terms. She could walk away completely. But on the night before she needed to give them an answer, she took the paracord bracelet off her wrist, and instead of hiding it under her sleeve, she tied it to the outside of her scrubs. She put it where everyone could see it. She made it visible. The next morning, she went back to the hospital and told them yes. She took the trauma specialist position. She disclosed everything about her military background. She agreed to let her work be reviewed. She agreed to operate within the civilian medical system. And she agreed to teach, which meant Chen became her first student, learning the field medicine protocols that could save lives in the moments when the standard protocols weren't enough. Morrison saw the paracord bracelet on the first day she came back. He was walking past her station, and he stopped when he saw it, visible on her wrist, no longer hidden. "You look different," he said. "I'm not hiding anymore," Rachel said. He nodded. He didn't apologize for the suspension. He didn't need to. Instead, he said, "Good. We need you." Marcus Cole came by the hospital 3 days after Rachel accepted the position. He was cleared for discharge, and he wanted to see her before he left. She found him in the waiting room, and they sat together for a few minutes. "Are you going back?" he asked. "To the military?" "No," Rachel said. "I'm staying here, but I'm not hiding who I am anymore. That's different from going back. That's just being honest." "Phantom is back," Marcus said. "Phantom never left," Rachel said. "I just forgot I was her for a little while." Marcus smiled. "You saved my life again. That makes twice. That's a debt I can never repay." "You don't need to repay anything," Rachel said. "You're alive. That's the only payment that matters." After Marcus left, Rachel went back to the ER. She was starting her first shift as a trauma specialist the next day, and she wanted to prepare. She wanted to make sure the equipment was where she needed it. She wanted to test the protocols that would be different from what she'd been working with. But mostly, she wanted to stand in the space where the transformation had happened, where the pilot had grabbed her wrist and whispered a call sign, where her secret had come into the light, where everything had changed. She stood in that spot, looking at the empty bed, and she thought about the 7 years she'd spent trying to be someone she wasn't, trying to hide the part of herself that could do impossible things under pressure, trying to be invisible instead of essential. And she thought about the moment when all of that had fallen apart. Not because someone forced her, not because she couldn't hold it anymore, but because someone needed her to be exactly who she was, and hiding wasn't an option. The weight that had been pressing down on her chest for 7 years, the weight of the 3 soldiers, the weight of failure, the weight of pretending to be ordinary. That weight was still there. It probably always would be. But it was different now. It was the weight of something real, instead of the weight of a lie. I'm Jess, and this is the part where I tell you what I learned from this story. My brother did 2 tours in the military. When he came home, he struggled with the transition to civilian life. He said that being a soldier had made him good at certain things, staying calm under pressure, making decisions that could mean the difference between life and death, understanding what it took to keep people alive in impossible situations. But those skills didn't translate to the regular world. In the regular world, people didn't need someone who could perform emergency medicine or make split-second decisions under fire. They needed someone who could go to meetings and fill out paperwork and pretend that everything was normal. He told me that the hardest part wasn't the PTSD, though he had that too. The hardest part was feeling like the part of himself that mattered, the part that was essential, had become useless. So he hid it, like Rachel did. He became a different person. He tried to disappear into a normal life. It took him a long time to realize that the skills that mattered in the military don't stop mattering just because you're not in a war zone. They still exist. They still make you who you are. And hiding them doesn't make you safer or better or more normal. It just makes you invisible. Rachel figured that out in one night, when a pilot grabbed her wrist and whispered a call sign. When her secret came into the light, when she realized that the person she'd been hiding was actually the person she needed to be. So here's the question. What part of yourself are you hiding? What skill, what strength, what piece of your identity are you pretending doesn't exist? And what would change if you stopped hiding it? You don't have to shout it from the rooftops. You don't have to make it your entire identity. But you can stop hiding it. You can let it exist. You can be the person you actually are instead of the person you think you're supposed to be. Rachel did. And it saved a life. It might save your life too if you let yourself be honest about who you are. That's the story of Phantom. That's the story of a call sign whispered in the dark. That's the story of a clipboard falling to the floor and a secret finally being told. I'm Jess. Thank you for listening.